And we have a new opening slide here because I just finished the layout and the cover and everything for this book. And so I'm just insufferably proud of it right now. I'm sharing it everywhere I go. Um, Uncle Roy's Computer Repairs and Used Robot Parts was officially announced last week as the 2024 Best Novella by the Analog Readers in their AnLab Awards. And I've been sitting on that saying, okay, as soon as they announce that, I have to have a collection ready to go with Uncle Roy's as the title story. And so I've got that just about ready to go. Working with my editor, hi Anne Marie, to finish up getting that to a point where we can put it up for pre-orders. Having an absolute ball with this collection. It will be 25 stories and poems, two poems, because sometimes poetry happens. It's just this ugly accident that comes along, um, including the title story. And also, it will have my Writers of the Future 24-hour story, Hamal in Hollywood, will be the tentpole of the collection. It is, I believe, out of 25 stories and poems, 15 previously published, 10 brand new, never seen before. So this will be, as soon as we put the final edits to bed, I will submit it to Amazon for pre-order, and it will then probably take 72 hours at the worst. They say 72. I've never seen it be more than 12 for it to be available for pre-order. So I'm just tickled pink about this collection. But that's not what we're here for today. I just had to brag.
It is well worth bragging about, just so you know.
All right, so we've come together for Jazz Session number 10, How Long is a Piece of String? We're going to talk about story lengths in different genres and methods for how to hit them. Now, it seems like every week lately I say this might be a short one, and I end up going like 80 or 90 minutes. But really, this might be a short one. It'll depend in part on what your questions are, but it might be a short one. It's fewer slides than the number of slides I've had on some of the other ones. But we're going to talk not just on story length, but techniques of how to hit the length. But first, of course, we have to have our little
$1 million.
All right, I'm not actually looking for $1 million. I am, however, obviously looking to sell my books. I am having a number of debuts this summer, besides Uncle Roy's coming out that we just looked at. I will have, at some point soon, I will have another Maxwell's Demons story. And of course, we've got the Writers of the Future bundle, which launches on the 11th. So we're practically there. That'll be this Saturday. And so that is going to give me a debut every month this year since I believe April. Yeah, I think that'll be a debut every month. So I'm trying to build up a little momentum in my little train engine. I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. So this week, paying for the soup, obviously I want to talk about making story models, which you've all heard me talk to death. Again, it is my book on visualizing tools for writers trying to either plan your story or analyze your story or work out story problems. On the left, we have my tribute collection, Today I Remember, from Wordfire Press, Kevin J. Anderson, Rebecca Mesta, and the crew there. And this is this week's selection because I had a very heartwarming but also sad and touching conversation today, or not today, this week, from Mrs. Dr. Phil. Now, most of you probably aren't familiar with Dr. Phil, not the guy on TV. We call him our Dr. Phil. Dr. Philip Edward Keldon was a science fiction writer who was also a very, very, very dedicated science teacher which probably kept his career back because he put so much into A, his wife and family, and B, his teaching, that he basically, summer vacation was his writing time. He did some great stuff. He was a constant contender in Writers of the Future, never did manage to win. It was delightful to when I discovered him because he's basically been in my backyard my whole life and I didn't realize it. He was teaching down in Kalamazoo while living up in Allendale. I was living in Hopkins and working down in Galesburg. We were driving more or less the um, same highways back and forth for work for much of my career. Um, Dr. Phil and I were both huge science and science fiction fans right in the same neighborhood practically my whole life, and I didn't discover him until I started being a professional writer and started running into him at conventions, not local events here. I'd run into him at conventions. Um, and he was a wonderful gentleman to work with. I was on a panel with him. I read stories by him. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years back. And driving home from work that day, I started dictating a story for him. And I had to pull off the side of the road and park because I couldn't see because my tears were welling up so much. And that story is one of the stories in today I remember. And I'm bringing up that collection because his wife has had the collection since 2020, but just this week started reading it and had gotten to the story about Dr. Phil. Bookmarked is the name, and had wanted to thank me for it. So that made me say, gee, here's the book I ought to talk about this week. So, you know the drill here. We're talking about tools, not rules. Anybody who tells you something is a rule is either naive or selling something. Because as Goldman told us, nobody knows anything. Nothing is guaranteed to work. Nothing is guaranteed to fail. But people often couch things, myself included, in the terminology of rules because it's bombastic, it's forceful. But remember, there's always exceptions on this. However, when we get into lengths, sometimes there are no exceptions. So let's talk about story lengths. So, this story is 6 pages long. This unreadable story, however, is 1 page long. Here's the reality, and this was coming up in a writing group just today. Pages are meaningless. Pages mean nothing. Word count is what matters. Unfortunately, to readers, they don't get this. They really don't. Even when I've explained it to them and explained and given them examples of the 6-page story and the 1-page story, intuitively they think that pages are a measure of length. And it depends on so much about font and font size and layout and margins and so on and so on and so on. But they're convinced that a 200-page book is only half as much content as a 400-page book. We as writers need to think in words. But it can be important. Pages matter for print books. I'm in the middle of preparing my print version of Uncle Roy's. The number of pages affects what the printing cost is going to be because it affects the actual physical paper they have to ship, and therefore affects the cost of fuel they have to pay. So pages have some importance for print books, which is why back in the days when pocket books were first introduced as very, very cheap, pulpy books you could literally stick in your pocket, the font was tiny because they were trying to fit as much in as they could. So yes, they had to deal with page limits, but they dealt with it by cramming more in, tighter and tighter margins and smaller fonts. Pages can also be important, and more generally, column inches can be important for the print media, which aren't dead yet. Anybody tells you they're dead, it's like, well, no, they're They're changed. They're smaller and more selective, but they're still out there. And it used to be really important for column inches because that's how papers are laid out. Is you have so many columns, I think it's 8 columns on a page, but it might be 6, and so many inches, which is the length of the page, and that's your space you have to fill with stories and advertisements and photos and editorials and. So column inches mattered a lot in that world. But they really feel important to readers. We know it's misleading. Readers think the number of pages matters. And it's one of the most frustrating questions I get because people will ask me how long a book is, and it's like 93,000 words. Well, what's that in pages? Well, are you using a large print book? Are you using a tiny, tiny, tiny book? Kindle, and I assume other e-readers, but Kindle's the one I know most, deals with this partly with what they call a Kindle KENP. I think it's Kindle Effective Normalized Pages. This is important for Kindle because they have the Kindle Unlimited program, which not all books are in, but some books are in. Kindle Unlimited is books that people who have Prime can read for free. As many of them as they want, as many pages as they want. They read it for free, but the authors get paid per page read. That means it's important to define a page because Kindle isn't paying me anything for these pages, but these pages, well, that's crammed a little tight. The concept of a normalized page is they have said a certain number of words is a page. And they pay on the pages read. Their payment varies because it's dependent on how many people sign up for Prime that month. And sometimes it's just how much money they want to dump into it to support the program. There is a fund of money that they say all Kindle pages this month are worth $17 quadrillion. And then we look at how many pages were actually read and divide 17 quadrillion by that. And that's how much each author gets paid per page. Now, it's not $17 quadrillion, but it adds up. Latest estimate for June is that a page read, a normalized page read, was $0.004, or basically 0.4 cents, give or take in that range. And it's like, well, okay, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that adds up. I mentioned I've had a release a month coming out in the summer months. Last month, my Kindle ENP, the normalized page reads, were something just over 2,000 pages. Now, 2,000 times $0.004 is not huge, but it's $8. So if I were to be able to successfully increase my marketing to put another zero on that, it's $80. So pages, in a sense, matter for that. But remember, their normalized pages are really based on words, not pages. Now, if you hear a market talking about pages, that's a big red flag. And I'm going to, for purposes here, I'm going to include under markets, I'm also going to include writing groups because I've got 2 of them right now that are doing this and a market that are doing this. And I've tried to persuade them and it just doesn't work. They say, well, we're going to review 10 pages or 7 pages or something like that. There is a local radio theater group which specifies the length of a play in pages. This tells me that these people do not have enough writing experience to understand that words are what matters. Words are what gets paid for. But we can sometimes get around that by asking for a template document. So the radio theater group, for example, I said, can you send me an example script? And they sent me an example script. And then I reverse engineered from that. What is their font? What is their margins? What is their line spacing and so on? And eventually, what is their actual word target? but they think in pages. Now, to some extent, that makes sense. If they're at all connected to the screenwriting business, the screenwriting business is all about pages. It is absolutely all about pages, but the screenwriting business is also about fairly rigid templates. If you submit a screenplay and it doesn't conform to a couple of common templates, you're likely going to get rejected just for that. They're going to look at your first page and say, this person doesn't know how to lay out a script, so they don't know how to write scripts, so I don't want to see it. So in that world of screenplays, pages are kind of uniform. And the rule of thumb, and yes, pages vary, but the rule of thumb is a page of screenplay is a minute of screen time. And your typical screenplay is, call it 100 minutes. So you're going to have a 100-page script representing 100 minutes of screen time. If you come in with 250 pages, they don't even have to bother reading it. You're way off the edge. They're not going to look. If you come in with 20, they're like, this isn't a story. This is like a summary of a story. But if you've got a market or a writing group that's talking about how many pages you're supposed to submit, ask if they can give you a template for what a page is. Okay, so why does it matter? And I've just given a couple of examples. I'm going to give you the number one reason is the rules. Something I hear a lot from editors is somebody who can't get the basics right is somebody who's going to be difficult to work with and they'd rather not. So if they have told you that their limit is 5,000 words and you come in with 5,500, you can probably be in a discussion. But if they told you you've got 5,000, you're coming in with 50, they're done talking to you. So the length matters just because it's what they ask for. And I don't know about any of you, but I'm certainly not so special and important that they'll break their own rules for me. I mean, if I'm Stephen King, I can do whatever I want. I know an author who submitted some reprint material for an anthology, and the reprint material was not formatted in standard manuscript format at all. It was galley proofs from where the material had been published before, and it was just a matter of, well, that author's name is on the cover, is going to sell magazines, so editors, clean it up, because that person had the reputation. But for most of us, we got to follow the rules. And for a lot of markets, it also matters for the money, because a lot of markets are paying per word. I haven't run into a market recently that is paying per page other than poetry. Common thing I've heard, and I haven't tried to sell a lot of poetry. There are two poems, remember, in the Uncle Roy's collection, but I generally haven't tried to sell a lot of poetry. But the rule of thumb used to be $1 a page. So pages would matter there. But mostly they're paying per word and they only have so much budget. And they can only pay what they have in the budget. Editors will sometimes talk about people who are so desperate to get published. It's like, well, I know your limit is 5,000. I've written 17, but you can just pay me for the 5. Well, that gets into other concerns, but it also just smells of desperation, and the editors don't want to deal with desperate people. Find the right market for your story or find the right story for your market. And again, we can have print concerns. The length matters there. I'm going to steal a cautionary tale from Kevin J. Anderson. He's told it about 1,000,000 times, and it's in his book on professionalism. So it's not like it's not out there. But I'm going to tell an example. When he was asked to edit one of the first Star Wars anthologies, Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina. It was an anthology of stories consisting of the backstory on every character who was in the Mos Eisley scene from Star Wars, back when Star Wars was the name. This episode 4 stuff was like, never heard of it. But every character in that bar who was not Han or Luke or Chewie or Obi-Wan had a story, some life story that led them to that bar. And the point of the anthology was to tell those stories. And I don't know who was the person on Lucasfilm side who was doing this, but they had business arrangements with Kevin to edit this and to gather up. And here was his pile of money he had to spend on stories. And he had to gather up good, reliable people because Star Wars was a big thing then. It's still a big thing. Star Wars was a thing they didn't want to just hand off to just anybody, but Kevin had the reputation. Kevin had been working with different media tie-in properties. They said, Kevin, we're trusting you. Find the writers to write these stories. Here's the list of characters. We need somebody for every one of these stories. And he contacted friends, contacted people he knew, contacted some he didn't know, but he contacted all these people and got them lined up to tell stories and gave them the date and told them, here's the amount of money you're going to be paid and everything. He gave them a date with a big cushion because he knows that writers are sometimes a little bit slow. And so he gave them a date that was well in advance of when he absolutely had to have it. But he gave then, when the date came along, he gave like a month for managing to let people trickle in. And one person who had a fairly significant character still didn't have anything after that month. Now, Kevin isn't sweating yet. He's not happy, but he's not sweating because he knew there was still more in his buffer. And then a couple months later, and the person still hasn't turned in the story, but they're telling him how great it is and how much he's going to love it. And it's like, now we're heading towards the real deadline. And now Lucasfilm has started promoting the book. They've got pictures of it and everything. Now Kevin really needs this story to come from this author on time. And the person came in finally way late, even by the real deadline, came in way late and came in at well more than double the promised length. Now, Kevin has learned since then. When you write the contract, you make sure they understand that you are paying X cents per word up to this limit, and after that, you don't get any more. The contract as it was written, that person who turned in a story twice as long as it had to be, as it was supposed to be, was entitled to twice the money. Lucasfilm wasn't handing out any more money, so it came out of Kevin's pocket as the editor. But on top of that, remember I said Lucasfilm had already been showing off pictures of the book? The book had been laid out. And as a person who's recently in the middle of laying out my next print book, I can tell you that means finding out precisely how thick the spine of your book has to be because you have to fit a certain number of pages in. And because this person's story was so long, the spine would no longer fit the pages in the book, which meant they had to go back and do another round of redesign on the covers. And Lucasfilm isn't happy about this either. And that redesign, designer's got to be paid. That had to be paid for out of Kevin's pocket because that person did not respect the length limits. And that person mysteriously has never gotten invited to another Kevin anthology. So sometimes with print, it really can be a crucial business matter. Again, length matters to readers because they only have so much time. They have so much time they can spare, and they want something they can read within that time. Maybe they've got a long holiday weekend, and they can devour 4 books this weekend. Okay, I couldn't, but Dawn Ray could. I don't know if she's on the call or not, but I know Dawn Ray could. But maybe what you've got is, oh, gee, I've got a half hour before bed. I want to read something quick. So the reader cares about length sometimes because of what they have available. And sometimes it matters just for expectations. That some people want that big, thick goat gagger of a book. That's what they read for. And other people want, hey, I want something I can read on my train ride into work. So the length matters for those reasons. And we'll see about this on a slide coming up here very shortly, they matter for awards because awards are often grouped into different lengths. And so what length your story is determines which categories of awards you're eligible for. And sometimes it can be wrong. Speaking of the AND Labs, Analog Analytical Laboratories, they are reader voted awards. It's basically they've got kind of a phase where, hey, we're asking the readers what they want to do here. And the readers see that the stories in Analog are specifically already categorized as novella, novelette, or short story. But if it comes time to something like the Hugo or the Dragon Awards, fans go and make submissions of anything they loved that year, and fans don't know necessarily what the proper length is for a story. And so sometimes fans can be submitting something for a category it's not eligible for, and it gets all sorts of votes, and it cannot possibly win that category. Or sometimes you've got the opposite, the risk of being wrong. You have the risk of competing against yourself. I had one year where I had a novelette and a novella. Novelette being sort of a mid-length story and a novella just short of a novel, both in Analog that year. If they had been two novellas, I would have been essentially competing against myself and taking votes away from myself, guaranteeing that I'm not going to win in that category. And I'm not saying that I ever looked and said, you know, I could bring this down to novelette if I chopped 500 words off of this, but it's something you might consider. But I never did that. I never. So length matters for the awards, and in fact, the awards categories from the different writing associations are the best definitions of what different categories are, because that's what's going to be run by many of the publishers and by their award seasons. And a lot of us, because of who I am and who I know, a lot of us here are probably involved heavily with science fiction and fantasy. And so everybody talks about those lengths, sometimes forgetting it's very different in other genres. So science fiction and fantasy, anything up to 1,000 words is flash. 1001 to 7500 is a short story. 7501 to 17500 is a novelette. 17501 to 40,000 is a novella. Now, good luck finding any of the major markets that will take a 40,000 word novella. I managed to sell Analog a 24,000 word one 6-7 years back, but I contacted ahead of time and said, hey, Trevor, I want to send you this. Can I? And what I wanted to send him was 33,000 words. And he said, no, but if you get it down to 24,000 and I've already published other stuff in this series, I'll take a look at it. I doubt you're going to find any of the major markets that are publishing 40,000 word novellas. On the other hand, self-publishing, you can publish whatever you feel like because you're not paying per word, you're paying the sweat of your brow. But you could do, certainly, I've been doing some 30,000 word novellas this summer. Above that, 40,001 above, that's a novel, according to science fiction. Then we go over to horror. They don't have the concept of flash fiction. They don't really have even a short story. They have a category they call short fiction, which is anything not up to 7,500. So it's under 7,500 is short fiction. Long fiction is 7,500 to 39,999, and 40,000 and up is a novel. Mystery does have a flash fiction, and just because they got to be cantankerous, they're off from us by one. That instead of 1 to 1,000, it's 1 to 999. Their short stories are anything to 22,000, and then above that is novel. We're going to skip romance because it's complicated. Isn't it always complicated in romance? We'll come back to romance. But the one that surprised me was Western only has two categories, short fiction and book length. And for Western, book length is 10,000 words and up. Now, I haven't written in that genre, so I don't know if that's what the publishers say. But if you're of a mind to write Westerns, you might look into that because you might be able to do a lot of shorter novels, shorter book length, and have a market there that I haven't been in that section of the library in a long time, but I do remember they used to be sometimes pretty short books. Of course, back when I was a kid, Science fiction novels of the 40 to 50,000 range were common. You don't find a lot of those today. But so Western only has the two categories, and thriller actually has also the two categories, but theirs are completely different. The break is at 35,000 words. And finally, let's go back to romance because it really is complicated. The general, Dawn Ray has entered the waiting room. Dawn Ray is joining us. The general categories for romance are we have a short story is anything under 20,000 words. A novella is 20,000 to 40,000. And then they have some special categories. They have a short novel, which is 40 to 56, mid-length, which is 56 to 80, and long novel is 80 and above. Except romance, I don't know how many of you are aware of this. Romance is far and away the biggest genre out there with the most subgenres because practically any other genre is also potentially subgenre of romance. So you have science fiction romance, mystery romance, historical romance, etc., etc., etc. So if you look at historical romance, their short novels are anything from 40,000 to 83,000. And then they've got all these other categories, erotic, mainstream, paranormal romance. Those are 40,000 up for short novels with no upper limit. And then historical romances, why historical needs to be different from general romance. Historical romance says that a long novel is 83,000 words and up. So again, these are all drawn from the web pages of the associations for these groups. So SFWA for science fiction, HWA for horror, RWA for romance, and so on. These are categories drawn from their specific websites for eligibility for awards. And come on. Come on. And they mean absolutely nothing. I just had you look at all of these, and I'm going to tell you they mean nothing if your market has entirely different guidelines. Yes, these different associations define their categories for their different genres, but the publishers are not bound by these, so it helps to check. One example that I specifically know well is Writers of the Future. Now, as all of you I'm sure are aware by now, I love Writers of the Future. I'm highly devoted to them. I help them out anytime I can, and sometimes they drive me completely crazy. Their guidelines have gotten better through the years, but their guidelines used to be for whether or not you're eligible were no more than 3 short stories and no more than 1 short novel or a single novel. Now, you go back and you look and say, okay, short story. So that's up to 7,500 words. And a novel is 40,000. What's a short novel? And so people are trying to guess this because, right, okay, I was going to say writers are stupid, but humans are stupid. They will sit and spend hours fretting, but not spend minutes asking. And so they're all trying to guess how to interpret these categories for Writers of the Future. And I'm like, I send an email to Joni and I say, Joni, it says no more than 3 short stories. What is a short story by your definition? And I did more than I should have. I actually showed her all this information, but it really didn't matter. What it mattered as far as Writers of the Future was concerned is Writers of the Future is a short story contest for short story authors. And Writers of the Future accepts stories up to 17,000 words. So Writers of the Future says 17,000 words is a short story. You don't find that anything like that here in this chart. But it's the market that decides. Ultimately, they're the ones who are deciding to sign the check. If a market tells you that 15,000 words is a novel, you nod and say, and what are your novel rates? So you always have to check the market's guidelines. The categories here are general. but different publishers have different approaches. You'll especially find this complicated when publishers come in who are new or are crossing over. That somebody who could come in from science fiction and fantasy as an editor and start editing thriller and just completely confuse the world with what they think is a short story and a novelette and a novella and so on. When you're close to a limit, just ask, or plead with them, but just ask. Again, I just went to Joni and said, tell me. They don't want to make things difficult for writers submitting. This is not just Writers of the Future. This is editors in general. Editors desperately need one thing. They need writers who reliably can send them good stuff on a regular basis. That's their chief need because they've got a magazine to fill every month. If you can't reliably send them a story every once in a while, they're less interested. If you are difficult to deal with and confused all the time, they're less interested. If you've got one brilliant story in you, they're not that interested because, okay, that fills one issue of the magazine. Now they've got another for, in case you're Analog or Asimovs, which are your bi-monthlies, they've got 5 more to fill this year. And if they put all their effort into satisfying you with your one brilliant story, they have let down the magazine. What they'd rather have is people who ask. People, if you're confused, ask. Just ask. You're a professional. They're professionals. Don't be afraid. Just ask. Okay. So we've talked about what some of the lengths are. Before we get into length strategies, do we have questions on any of those lengths? I saw some things popping up here. Let me see if we had any. Historical romance, yes, definitely broken into several subgenres. Romance, again, is its own whole market by itself. It is absolutely its own separate thing because they've got so many readers with so many tastes that they just keep splintering off to new categories and finding new readers and making more money. So the rules for romance, more than anywhere, are look at your market and see what they're doing. Okay. So let's talk about some length strategies. And I've broken it down into 6, and then we'll look at the details of each one. The biggest one, the most mechanical one, is scope. And I actually break scope into several sub areas of scope. One of the biggest one that I think matters a lot more than we give it credit for is character scope. Oh, we're seeing more in the chat. What we got? Yeah, subgenres. Yes, we saw that. Yes, romance keeps the light on in publishing. Absolutely. All right. So the concept of character scope. I hit, come on, back up, back up. So the concept of character scope is a mathematical concept that I bring to the discussion from networking, from computer networking. It's the number of possible connections in a network. And it tends to grow roughly as the power of 2 of number of nodes in the network. And it really kind of does that with characters as well. Keeping in mind, we're looking at potential. Not that this is what you have to have in a story, but it's where your story can grow if you're not careful. So let's say you have a story with one character, Bob, who is doing some stuff. Maybe he's out surviving in the wilderness. He has nobody to talk to, nobody to interact with, just him against the wilderness. So therefore, we have a scope of 1, Bob. Now along comes Bill. All of a sudden, we can have parts of the story that are just Bob. We can have Bob talking to Bill. We can have parts of the story that are Bill by himself. So our scope has gone up to 3. Bob, Bill, and Bill. And then we introduce Barb. And Barb, these are actually my cousins, Bob, Bill, and Barb. Barb now gets us to a point where we can have Bob talking to Bill, Bob talking to Barb, Bob talking to Bill and Barb, Bill talking to Barb and Barb. So our total potential scope there is 7 possible avenues of exploration. If we introduce Beth, I'm not going to even walk through them. It comes up to 15. If we introduce Ben, the scope is 31. These are all potentials. They are not mandatory, but they are things that your story could grow into. And if your characters are never going to interact with Ben, then if Ben isn't part of the scope, then why did you introduce him into the story? Yes, there are minor characters. Often the minor characters don't even get names. If you're bringing a named character into the story, your scope is going to grow. So that is one measure of scope. Another measure of scope is this ill-defined thing we call a beat, which is if you were to sit down and tell somebody an outline or plan for your story, every point you make is roughly a beat. And that is really fuzzy. It's incredibly fuzzy. In one place, the beat might be, we're going to fight the bad guys to get them out of our headquarters so we can take it back. And you've got it in the outline as fight the bad guys. And that's a huge, huge, huge thing. And you might have another beat, which is Bob learns that he's been betrayed and now he doesn't trust anybody. So beats are rough, but if you have some sort of an outline or a plan, just count the beats. Look at all these points in your outline and then look at how many words on average you write per beat. So you look at some of your old stories and count the beats in those and count the number of words and do this magic math we call division. So that's one way to figure out what your average words per beat is. And you want to do stories that are kind of similar in tone, that if it's a military story, you want to compare to military stories, not to slap happy comedy stories. You might also, if you don't have stories to compare to, write your first few beats and average. How many are you spending with, how many words are you putting in for these 5 or so beats? And now words per beat times beats gets you a very rough measure of your story scope. Again, it's going to differ for different stories and different genres, and it will also change over time. As your style starts to change, as you learn new techniques, you're going to find this changing. So you're going to have to re-estimate beat scope as your career develops. And the last one is location scope, which really kind of ties into beat scope or character scope. It's in addition to it. Every time you have a new location in the story, you're going to have to introduce that location, describe it. Why are they there? What are they there for? What challenges are in it, so on. So at least you've got a beat or 2 for every location. At least, probably more. And every time you change locations, if I'm going to go from the bookstore to the Apple store, am I going to talk about actually making the trip? Probably not, because they're all in the same mall. But if I am talking about it, if there's some reason why I have to explain this, such as, oh, gee, by the way, there's a huge mob who is there to get tickets for an event, and I have to find my way through the mob, there's another beat for that part of the travel. And if it's really significant, you add more beats in. Also, if you find yourself going back to a location, ask yourself why. Why'd you go back there? There may be more beats happening there. I know some filmmakers have this rule because they want very visual and dynamic films that they try never to go back to the same location twice without a damn good reason. That they want to keep seeing new locations, new sets, new visuals. So they try to keep it that you're not going back. But if you're going back, there's some important reason that that is your home, your safe space, or that is a place where there was unfinished business and you had to go back to it. So if you're returning to a location, that introduces new beats. So let me go back and talk about the scope elements here again. We have scope, which is based on your number of characters who might interact. We have scope based on the beats in an outline, if you have an outline. Pantsers like me, we don't. But if you have an outline, look at the beats in there. And we have beats based on location. So that is one thing of saying, I know that I'm averaging 500 words per beat, and this looks like a 7-beat story, so that looks like 3,500 words. Now, one approach to the length issue, which is kind of my preferred approach, but I understand why sometimes we don't do this. Write the story, then look for the market. And maybe you have to do some cutting to fit the market, or you might have to expand. And we'll talk about ways of doing both of those below. So write it, then market it, but you do have to ask yourself the question, is it still your story? Do you still love it? Now, I don't want to sound all hippy dippy freaky here, but you do need to love your work. You do need to be proud of your work. Okay, if you're one of the big ones, the Stephen Kings of the world, you can write for money. I have to tell you, I've had some fairly nice success in my work. I cannot possibly live on what I'm making right now as a writer. I would need to step up everything I'm doing by a factor of 10 or more to live on my writing. I'm not writing for the money. I am taking all the money I can get, but I'm not writing for the money. I'm writing for other reasons. And if I compromise those reasons just for the money, it better be a lot of money. Harlan Ellison used to have a saying, he can't be bought, but he can be rented, and it's expensive. So sometimes you will compromise because you want to make the sale, but always think about, are you actually still telling your story, or are you just following a trail of breadcrumbs laid down by some editor somewhere? Nothing against editors, Anne Marie, but I want my vision. Now, ways to write short. If you've learned what your average words per beat are, then as you're writing, you might not be busy counting words. For instance, for me, I'm dictating, but I can sort of count beats and say, I've been doing about 500 words per beat. Well, okay, that's going to be, I've done this and this and this. I'm going to say that I've got like 6 beats that I've done so far. So I've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 words. As I'm writing, I'm also thinking about future beats and character scope and location scope. If I need to be writing short, as I'm writing, I start cutting back on those. I start saying, yes, I thought that was interesting, but do I really need it? Or, and here's an exact opposite of advice that's given very flippantly so often, the show, don't tell. Sometimes the best way to write shorter is to tell, don't show. Sometimes there are things you just don't need to show. You can summarize in a paragraph what might take a page to show. Again, looking at character scope, maybe we don't need that character. Somebody else could do what that character's doing. Or we could take that character and just tell, don't show. Same for locations. Sometimes you've got a location where, yes, it's important that you went to the bank, but do you actually have to show the visit to the bank and the sweat on your forehead because you don't want the banker to realize what you're really up to? Well, if it's tension, then you want to show it. But if it's just, I went to the bank and I was nervous, tell, don't show. And so if you're trying to write short, look for opportunities to cut these before you're writing. Or write first, cut later. Again, get it written, and now you start looking for big cuts you can make. And some of these can be cutting whole plot. Some of it can be characters and storylines. Again, cutting back on the scope. Sometimes cutting elimination. But sometimes it can just be cutting plot. And it's something you really, really have to think about if you're trying to get into a certain market and your idea is just too big. And I have an example of this that is, in fact, in Uncle Roy's Computer Repairs and Used Robot Parts, a story called A Line in the Sand. Sean Hazlett asked me to contribute a story for consideration for the Weird World War IV anthology. And I am not a military person. I don't write war stories, but I realized I could write an espionage story. And I started having this grand vision of a James Bond type story in space. And I may still write that some point because nobody has ever actually done James Bond in space. And if you mention the awful movie, I'm afraid I'm going to have to hunt you down and kick you in the shins, because that was one of the worst things that ever happened to the franchise. So I really sort of want to do that James Bond in space story, but that's really a novel. And Sean's saying 5,000 words. Like, okay, well, I could cut it down to this, the final act, and that'd be 15,000 words. Like, no, 5,000. Okay, I've got it down to really just this chunk right here, and I can do that in 11,000 words. And Sean's like, 5,000. Okay, I've got it down to 9, 5,000. I've got it down to 8, 5,000. I've got it down to 6,500, 5,000. The story as submitted was 4,995 words, under the 5,000 limit. What I did, you're probably familiar with the structure of James Bond movies. If you're not, there is a scene that's not in every one, but it's in many of the most popular ones, which is the cavalry scene, which is the CIA or the ninja assassin school or the clown circus or whatever, whoever James's allies are, show up for a big fight against all the gathered bad guys that have been threatening the world, and they're all going to go fight. In the meantime, the villain sneaks away, because the villain's got one final plan to salvage this, even with the cavalry coming in and tearing everything down. The villain's got one final death-defying trap that is going to finally win, and James has to follow him and stop him. And that's the part that I wrote, was the James following and stopping him part. All the rest of it was implied in very, very, very tell, don't show, but I cut out everything but the exciting conclusion of the agent against the counter agent and trying to stop the big death device from going off. So cutting plot can sometimes involve just selecting out that piece that you really need for this market, and you can tell the rest later. But you might also be, instead of cutting plot, you might look at characters, storylines, locations, and so on. Other techniques for cutting, I think I've mentioned this in context of other discussions we've had, but I've talked to so many writers I can't remember here. One of them is the memorable manuscript approach. You take your manuscript, put it away, take a break, go play with your cats or your kids or your garden or whatever, go to a movie, get rested, come back to a quiet room, turn on a tape recorder, and tell your story to yourself. The parts you remember are the story. You've got this great big long thing you've written, but you set it aside. And what you are telling yourself in the recorder is the parts that excite you, and therefore are probably the exciting parts of the story. And take out everything else. So the take a break and listen to it, tell yourself the story approach is one way to do really drastic cuts, because you're down to the core story from all sorts of other stuff you did. My last resort, and I've done this more times than I want to admit, is every 10th word. Look at 10 words and find one you can get rid of. Maybe you come up with 2 words that can be replaced with one stronger word. Maybe you get rid of qualifiers. Do you really need kind of? Do you really need sort of? Do you need very? Get rid of the qualifiers. Get rid of the dialogue tags, because readers don't need them nearly as much as we writers think they do. Cut every 10th word, and if you haven't hit your goal, do it again and do it again. But as you're doing it, don't eliminate your voice. This is your story. This is not the editor's story. This is your story. I'm going to get up on my soapbox here. I think sometimes editors and the market in general comes at you with this theory that sparse newspaper-like reporting style writing is the proper way to write. No, it is a way to write. It was Hemingway's style. Whereas I always get Faulkner and Fitzgerald confused, but I think it was Faulkner had just exactly the opposite style. What Hemingway could say in one word, you could say in five, and Faulkner could say in 50. But Hemingway was very careful on what that one word was, and Faulkner was very careful on those 50. They had reasons they were saying things the way they were. Don't eliminate your voice. When you have a way of talking, or a way of writing that reflects your way of talking. Don't be eliminating it needlessly. Because one of the things you very often hear from acquisition editors is the thing they want more than just about anything else is a unique voice. So if you are going and cutting just for word count, or worse, letting ChatGPT or Microsoft Word or something like that dumb down your style because you want it to be very, very smooth and vanilla and mushy, you're eliminating the thing they're looking for. Don't eliminate your voice. But I have occasionally done the every 10th word thing, such as when I'm down to 5,500 words and I still need 500 to go. And that's like, well, that's every 10th word. Sometimes, though, you need to think about writing long. Uh, Carrie English, one of my dearest writing friends, talks about taker outers versus putter inners in the editing phase. And she is very much a putter inner, that she's not writing long enough very often. I don't know how she does that. I do not know how. But if you need to write longer, again, if you know your average words per beat and you find that you are running short, maybe you need more beats. Could you add complications and setbacks? Could you add more characters? Characters who would be affected by the plot that you didn't think about before. As you're adding these beats, locations, travel, as you're writing these, turn it around the other way. Now lean heavily on show, don't tell. Now don't summarize when you could add detail. Make it meaningful detail. Don't make it boring detail. Make it meaningful, or you're going to have readers upset because you described one more leaf in the book. Now, I happen to think Tolkien's descriptions of leaves are just amazing. But I know people who stopped reading at about the third leaf description. Again, are there other people who could also react to this? Their allies, their enemies. Can you add more for characters to do? All of thinking show, don't tell. When in doubt, do something. Blow something up, kill somebody, a fight or something. Add in an event that happens that changes the status quo and follow those changes. In general, you can do this before you write if you're an outliner. If you're a pantser, on the other hand, just do it as you go or do it after. So after you've got it finished, look and say, are there things I could add up this? Scope I could add? Are there things I could do for more locations? Could I add complications, setbacks? Again, blow things up. So either try to write longer as you're writing, or do a Carrie putter inner approach after you've written. Go look for, oh, but what if? Add that in. Oh, but how about add that in, and so on. So, and I said I was going to probably be running short on this, and I'm looking at just about an hour. So I'm not running short, but I'm not running 90 minutes. So relatively, this is long, or this is a short one. That's basically what I have. Looking at our schedule coming up, next week we'll be looking at the goal game, questions and games for thinking through your story. Then we'll be talking about frame stories and other nonlinear narratives and how I met your story. Talk about the 4 levels on the 27th. The 3rd will be our next tribute, this time to Dean Wesley Smith. August 10th, we'll be talking about distance and scope in space. August 17th, we'll be talking about what improv has to teach us. 24th, we will be looking at Bradbury's method for writing. I call it panning for gold. 31st, we'll look at learning progression. And the 7th, we will start looking at story models. So do we have questions on length and scope here? What do we have on here in our chat? Wow, 9 chats. Okay, what did I miss? Get Bob volleyball. Yes, Bob has a volleyball that gives Bob a scope of 1 that he can communicate with his volleyball. As a reader, we get confused with the names Bob, Barb, and Bill. You would. Again, I grew up with them. They're my cousins. So for me, I could keep it straight. All right. Hemingway hunted for readers with bolt action rifle and Faulkner with a shotgun. I'll buy that. All right. Any questions on story lengths and story scope?
Martin, I have a question.
Sure.
Do you find that some people, they have a brain that just does a certain word limit no matter how much they try not to? And what can you do about that?
I will write a novelette unless I really work hard not to. It definitely is the case that people have their natural length. Jenna, after 11 years of this now, I will bet that Jenna does Flash without even having to turn her brain on. It's just there. Her brain says, ooh, I need this Flash story, and it needs to have these characters and this feeling and this mood, and there's a story. I do think people have their natural length. Breaking out of it is hard. Partly it is practice. I don't think I've mentioned anything about Dean once this week, but I'll mention Dean. Dean has advised that when you find something is difficult for you to write, write that. Write a lot of that. Write it until it's not difficult anymore because it's about practice. So consciously trying to write the lengths that don't come naturally to you helps. I generally do not even consider writing Flash. But I had an opportunity where Amazon was willing to pay me considerable sums for 3 Flash fiction stories. And all of a sudden, man, I managed to write some Flash. And from there, I got to the point of, okay, how did I do it? And I asked myself, besides just, hey, they want this done and they're going to pay for it, let's do it. I started asking my questions of what was the minimum I needed in that Flash. I'm still not good at it, but I've gotten better at it. Trying and practicing at it is a bigger thing. And then the context, the contents of the slides here, the methods for adding in or for taking out are something that's kind of a mechanical part of the editing process. So get your story written and then go through and try to clean it up or try to expand it. And after you've done that more and more times, you'll find yourself doing it in advance as opposed to after the fact. After you've done it enough, you're training your brain to think that way. And so all of a sudden now it's like, hey, this story is not running long enough for what I need. I need it to be longer. Okay, how am I going to make it longer? I don't remember if I told the story here, but on The Last Campaign, which Publishers Weekly praised as being meticulously plotted. And my friend Bill Emerson and I laughed because we knew that at a certain point in the story, I said, this story's getting done too soon. Everything's going too well for her. I need a murder. I need to kill somebody. I need to kill somebody right now. And I'm going through and chat with him the list of characters I've already introduced because it needs to be a character that the reader will care about and say, I can't kill this one. I can't kill this one. I can't kill this one because he's the red herring. Everybody's going to think he's the villain. And I said, if they all think he's the villain and I kill him off, I've just pulled the rug out from under them. And I stuck it in that, okay, he gets killed and I'll figure out why later. That sometimes you can learn to be better at these things because you've done them enough, you've thought about them enough that you start being able to do them as you're writing as opposed to as you're cleaning up later. But there's nothing wrong with cleaning up later. The reader won't tell the difference. Get it written and then say, I need to work on making more characters here or more scope here or less. Just practice. That's the biggest thing. Does that help?
Yes, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you.
All right. I think we had another voice in the chat. What was our new message? It gets easier to identify what doesn't add to the story and therefore easier for find things to cut. Yes. I do think that cutting is easier than adding because adding feels like fluff. Like you told the story you needed. Why do you need to add more? But the key to that, and I tried to hit in this in the slides on adding, is Your story has a world around it. Your world is affected by the events in the story. So one way to add in is just looking and saying, who's affected by this? Okay, well, my car broke down on the trip to the hospital and we found ourselves having to run to the hospital. Well, okay, but that left your car behind. What happened to your car? Well, A, does somebody run into it because you've left it on the side of the road? Or B, does somebody steal it? Or C, do the enemies who are following you use your car now to search to find information on you? Sometimes just going back and looking at implications of what you've got in there gives you the opportunity to explore new paths. And not all of them are productive paths, but you look for the ones that are. Other questions? All right. So there's our how long is a piece of string. I thank you all for joining me, especially on this holiday weekend where you were able to get away for this. I appreciate that. And I will stop the share and stop our recording.